On September 1st, 1939, the German army would send approximately 1.5 million soldiers, in addition with the German Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, to invade the country of Poland with a tactic known as the Blitzkrieg. Despite their former policies of appeasement toward German demands, the countries of France and Britain would declare war on Germany on September 3rd, thus starting the world's second global conflict. After the end of what the Allied forces dubbed as the Phony War, which was a period of minor military skirmishes that ended upon the German invasion of Norway in April 1940, Germany began to advance towards France from Holland and Belgium. The ensuing Battle of France would prove to be a swift German victory, as German forces managed to capture France in about 6 weeks, thanks in part to the success of the Blitzkrieg, German tanks, and the Luftwaffe. As the Germans continued to advance in France, the British Expeditionary Force, under the command of General Lord Gort, enacted Operation Dynamo, which called for the evacuation of Allied forces off the coast of Dunkirk, France. The evacuation was considered a success, and by June 4th, approximately 338,000 Allied soldiers were rescued by various ships, including British naval vessels and personal fishing boats. However, the losses sustained from the fighting and evacuation at Dunkirk was not small in the least. Around 60,000 men were either killed or wounded, with tens of thousands of weapons, vehicles, and equipment just left as a result of the evacuation. Now, with France out of its way, Germany would turn its attention to the lone British Isle. In a speech to the House of Commons on June 18th, Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill stated that, "What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us." And indeed, the ensuing great air battles over Britain would begin shortly, the success or failure of which would have an effect on the rest of the war to come. As Winston Churchill said, this was their finest hour. With the surrender of France on June 22nd, Adolf Hitler and his military leaders began to plan for the invasion of Britain. The plan, called Operation Sea Lion, involved a seaborne invasion of the southeastern coasts of Britain. Because of the natural protection that the English Channel provided, however, the Germans were faced with the need to control the skies. To do this, the German Luftwaffe would have to prove their air superiority by destroying the only threat to their plans, the British RAF, or Royal Air Force. Realizing the importance that the role of air superiority played during the First World War, Hitler had already begun to rebuild the German Air Force in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. The German Luftwaffe also proved to be far more combat-ready than that of the RAF. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War had provided the perfect training grounds, as the Luftwaffe sent several German pilots, known as the Condor Legion, to fight for the fascist nationals, who were led by General Francisco Franco. It was during this turmoil in Spain that German pilots began to draft new battle tactics, such as the Rote and the Schwarm formations, which departed from the standard three-man V-shaped or Vic formation in favor of two pairs of fighters, one being the leader while the other the wingman. In command of the entire Luftwaffe was Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. During World War I, Göring was a leading ace who would go on to receive the coveted Blue Max, and when World War II began, he was appointed by Hitler to be the supreme commander of the new German Air Force. With France in their possession, Germany established various Jagdgeschwader under the command of 5 Luftflotten, or air fleets. Luftflotte 2 and 3 would be the primary air fleets to see action during the Battle of Britain, with the former being based along the coasts of northeastern France and the latter more towards central France. With their new positions along the English Channel in Western Europe, the fighters and bombers of the Luftwaffe, consisting of approximately 2,800 aircraft, were closer to their targets in southeastern Britain. Despite what seemed to be a clear advantage for the German military, they were also plagued with a few problems that would ultimately hinder their effectiveness during the fight to come. Along these examples include a somewhat lack of willingness on Adolf Hitler's part to dedicate to a full invasion of Britain, poor intelligence systems which underestimated the growing strength of the RAF, and Hermann Göring's tremendous pride in the capabilities of the Luftwaffe despite fairly unorganized planning. Now with France occupied, Britain went on the defensive as it stood alone against the might of Germany in Western Europe. With the evacuation at Dunkirk, Britain was able to regain some of their fighting forces despite the heavy losses, and because of this, Dunkirk was deemed a success. Fortunately for the British, several fighter aircraft that were promised in order to reinforce squadrons fighting during the Battle of France were withheld in favor of remaining in Britain. Despite this, the RAF still had less aircraft when compared with the German Luftwaffe, but with the British Navy fighting in the Atlantic, the RAF was left to help defend the country. With a pause in the fighting, the British were now able to prepare for the defense of their island home. In charge of this defense was Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. Dowding was a veteran of World War I, having served as a squadron commander, and his belief that fighter aircraft would prove to be more useful for defending Britain against enemy bombardment proved to be an accurate assessment. As a result, the RAF would increase production of fighter aircraft, which would ultimately play a major role in the battle in the skies. These new fighter aircraft would be sent to Fighter Command, which was one of 4 divisions within the RAF. In preparation for a possible invasion, Dowding divided Fighter Command into 4 group sectors across the country. Number 11 Group was in charge of defending the southeast coast of Britain, and as a result, they would bear the brunt of most of the fighting during the upcoming battle. Air Chief Marshal Dowding was also responsible for creating the first integrated air defense system, which, among other elements, relied upon the latest advances in the development of radar to be utilized for detecting enemy aircraft. Radar stations were then constructed all along the coast of Britain and Scotland. These stations would soon be known as Chain Home and Chain Home Low for the stations that could detect enemy aircraft at lower altitudes. However, due to the technological limitations at the time, the radar was not as accurate as in modern times. To supplement for this, the RAF made use of the Observer Corps, which further helped to recognize enemy aircraft, gauge their distance and altitude, and then report it back to Fighter Command. With these early warning programs in place, Fighter Command could essentially know with relative accuracy what the situation was like, and could send the appropriate fighters to engage the enemy in a short amount of time. Because of the limited number of fighter pilots at their disposal, the RAF accepted several pilots from not only Britain, but also other British Commonwealths, as well as those from countries already occupied by Germany, such as Poland and Czechoslovakia. There were even 7 American pilots who would help by joining the ranks of the RAF. With all these elements, along with the many volunteers, many of whom were women, Britain was finally preparing itself for the long aerial confrontation that would shortly ensue. Having learned from the fighter aircraft of World War I, engineers on both sides had begun to design new warplanes from their observations and past mistakes, as well as utilizing the latest technological innovations at the time. Aircraft manufacturers had realized the limitations that the biplanes of the past presented, and despite more modern biplanes being produced at that time, the designers opted for monoplane designs, which consists of only 1 wing instead of 2 like that of a biplane, and would provide better performance qualities, such as increased speed, than would 2 wings. Because of this, monoplanes would be used extensively throughout World War II. Again, even though the Treaty of Versailles stated that Germany was to no longer have an air force, German engineers had secretly begun working on different bomber and fighter designs. In early 1935, German aircraft manufacturing company Heinkel would test their first HE-111 bomber design. This bomber had a top speed of approximately 270 miles per hour and could carry a heavy payload of about 4,408 pounds of bombs. The Heinkel HE-111s would see service while flying in Spain under the Condor Legion, and it would also be employed for blitzkrieg tactics in Poland and later for the bombing of British ground targets, especially the city of London during the Battle of Britain. Germany would also make use of another exceptionally powerful aircraft, the Ju-87, or as it was better known, the Stuka. The Stuka was a 2-man dive bomber of lethal capabilities that would also first see combat during the Spanish Civil War. The Stuka's 2-man crew consisted of a pilot and a rear gunner, and had a max speed of just barely 200 miles per hour, making this dive bomber an easy target for the faster British fighters. Despite the fact that this aircraft was almost obsolete by the time it was used in battle, the Ju-87's lethality would allow it to see action till the war's end. This aircraft would also be forever remembered for the screaming sounds that were created by its built-in sirens, known as Jericho's trumpets, as the Stuka dove in for its attack. The main fighter for the German Luftwaffe, however, would be the Messerschmitt Bf-109E. This was the latest German fighter at the time which had performance qualities that would closely rival that of the famous British fighter, the Spitfire. The Bf-109 was designed by aircraft engineer Willy Messerschmitt and could fly at a maximum speed of about 348 miles per hour at an altitude of 15,000 feet. The Bf-109E, which was the version that saw extensive use during the Battle of Britain, would be equipped with an armament of two 20mm MGFF cannons and two 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns. The exceptional qualities of this fighter would help to give it the necessary firepower to inflict enough damage to RAF fighters while protecting the Heinkel 111 bombers. The British RAF was also equipped with an impressive arsenal of fighter and bomber aircraft at their disposal, although in far more limited quantities as opposed to the German Luftwaffe. In the early 1930s, the RAF was still equipped with biplanes, the last of which would be the Gloucester Gladiator, which was a highly maneuverable fighter but lacked the speed to compete with the rising German fighters. In order to remain in competition with the German rearmament, the aircraft manufacturing company Hawker began to produce the fighter aircraft that would be known as the Hurricane. The Hawker Hurricane was an exceptional fighter with a top speed of around 325 miles per hour, and early variants contained 8 303 Browning machine guns, 4 on each wing, that were housed close together. Because of this, the Hurricane proved to be a useful fighter for taking out the German bombers, and, despite its slower speed, the Hurricane would help to claim more kills than even its famed counterpart. The second fighter used by the RAF would be the legendary Supermarine Spitfire. This amazing fighter aircraft was created by the aircraft manufacturing company Supermarine under the hard work and creative genius of their lead engineer, Reginald J. Mitchell. Mitchell had experience developing racing planes for Supermarine, which would help to win the Snyder Trophy for Britain, and with this prior experience, Mitchell would design one of Britain's greatest fighters. The Spitfire was one of the fastest and most maneuverable fighter aircraft at that time in World War II. However, its performances were closely rivaled by those of the Messerschmitt Bf-109E. Early variants of the Spitfire had a maximum speed of about 346 miles per hour at 15,000 feet, and the Mark 1A variant came equipped with an impressive armament of 8 303 Browning machine guns, 4 on each wing, which was a similar loadout to that of its companion, the Hurricane, the only difference being that the machine guns were more spread out across the wing. Unfortunately, the machine guns equipped on the Spitfire Mark 1A proved to be slightly underpowered, and as a result, later variants, such as the Mark 1B and the Mark II, would incorporate two 20mm cannons. Nevertheless, the Supermarine Spitfire would prove to be an excellent fighter for engaging enemy Bf-109Es, and along with the Hawker Hurricane, Fighter Command was now fairly equipped to defend Britain at all costs. It is said that the Battle of Britain can be divided into 4 phases, with the first phase starting on what is claimed to be the first day of the battle, which was July 10, 1940. During the opening days of the first phase of the Battle of Britain, the German Luftwaffe concentrated their attacks on merchant convoys carrying supplies in the English Channel. The reason for these attacks was to not only cut off British supplies, but to also bait Fighter Command into sending up their fighters to intercept the German bombers and fighters. By doing so, the Luftwaffe hoped to be able to destroy a good portion of the RAF fighters, while also determining the RAF's fighter strength. This first phase of the Battle of Britain would last until around August 12th, with Fighter Command having lost 27 Spitfires and 51 damaged, not a good amount considering the limited supply of Spitfires in the RAF. The second phase of the Battle of Britain would begin sometime around August 13th. On that day, also known as Eagle Day, the Luftwaffe would begin serious bombing operations, which would be escorted by large numbers of Bf-109E fighters. By this time, the Luftwaffe was determined to finally crush the RAF, and believing that the Luftwaffe would be victorious, Adolf Hitler would make Directive No. 16, which called for the preparation of Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. In order to strike a severe blow to Fighter Command, the Luftwaffe sent out several of their bombers, including Heinkel HE-111s and Ju-87 Stukas, to destroy critical RAF locations along the southeastern coast, such as airfields, aircraft factories, and radar stations. This would prove to be an important time for the RAF, and to counter this threat, Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons within No. 11 Group, which was led by Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, were sent up as soon as the radar stations and observer corps spotted enemy planes. Unfortunately for the Germans, Hermann Goering had made some false assumptions concerning the importance of effectively destroying the British radar and squadron airfields, and instead refrained from bombing these targets as much as they probably should have. This pause gave the RAF the chance to rebuild their radar stations and airfields in order to remain prepared for further attacks. Regardless of the efforts of the brave RAF pilots, there would still be heavy losses, with a total of 136 Spitfires lost in combat. However, the British fighter pilots were able to inflict far more substantial losses towards the Luftwaffe, thus showing that the RAF was not finished yet. The third phase of the Battle of Britain started on September 7th, as German bombers began the brutal bombardment of several British cities, especially London. The bombing of London began after a group of lost German bombers dropped their payload on the city by mistake before making their way back home. In response to this, Bomber Command sent aircraft into Europe to bomb the German capital of Berlin. These actions resulted in the terror bombing of London that would last well past the third phase of the battle and would kill thousands of civilians. But these actions only gave the British people and the few fighter pilots the determination to fight back even harder. The German bombing raids finally culminated on September 15th, which would prove to be the turning point of the Battle of Britain. On that day, British Spitfire and Hurricane fighters would intercept over 300 German bombers and over 250 Bf-109E fighters. The British pilots flying their Spitfires and Hurricanes engaged the enemy and were able to successfully repel the German assaults. As a result, September 15th would be remembered as Battle of Britain Day. On the 17th of that month, Hitler abandoned the plans for Operation Sea Lion indefinitely, favoring instead to attack Russia. The fourth phase of the Battle of Britain, which began around October 1st, saw the continuation of German high-altitude night and daylight bombing raids. Once again, Fighter Command detected and quickly sent up their fighters to intercept, causing more losses to the German Luftwaffe than to the RAF. Eventually, fewer German bombers and fighters were being sent since the Luftwaffe did not wish to sustain so many losses. On October 31st, something was not right. The skies, for the first time in a long while, were clear. The Battle of Britain was declared officially over on October 31st, 1940. However, German bombing raids would continue well into 1941. During the battle, especially in the third and fourth phases, civilian casualties totaled over 27,000, with about the same amount injured. On the other hand, 544 RAF pilots had lost their lives during this vicious struggle, a large amount when considering the small number of fighter pilots in the RAF. Of the aircraft within Fighter Command, they had lost 361 Spitfires alone, with more out of commission. Nevertheless, British forces were able to destroy 1,792 German aircraft, 610 of which were the prized Messerschmitt Bf-109Es. The Luftwaffe's plan of crushing the RAF had failed miserably. In a speech, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill would commemorate the brave pilots of the RAF when he said that never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Because of this, these airmen would be forever remembered as the few. Britain had survived to fight another day thanks to the sacrifices of the many courageous civilians and the few pilots. However, this would only be the beginning of Britain's fight against Nazi Germany in the following days of World War II.